Well, thanks so much, everybody, for coming out. It's a little bit warm, but not as terribly warm as it was before, and it's not depressingly rainy anymore. Good evening. As Asher mentioned, my name is Joshua Mason. I want to first off thank you all for coming out. Thank you to the Hopewell Museum for having me here, as well as the Hopewell Presbyterian Church for allowing us the use of their space. Our focus tonight, like Asher mentioned, is on Reverend James Ewing. He was a minister of the First Baptist Church here in Hopewell. Now, Ewing was born in Kilmarnock, which is a town in Scotland, in March of 1755. In a remarkable letter discovered by Lewis Layman, am I too far, too close? Oh, sorry, everyone look at my chins. They're really good. And I lined the beard up just for tonight too, so that's perfect. But in this remarkable letter provided by Lewis Layman, Ewing writes back to Scotland to his sister and brother-in-law. He writes them, includes a story about joining the 42nd Regiment of Foot sometime around 1779. The 42nd Regiment, you may know, they're known as the Royal Highlanders, or after their heroic actions at the Siege of Carillon, which is Ticonderoga in 1758, they become known as the Black Watch. They were a distinguished regiment in the British Army, but despite that prestige, Ewing didn't quite see his service as prestigious or even desirable. Here we go. Reverend Ewing, in his letter responding to his sister and brother-in-law, just writes the following. On September 15th, he deserted the British Army. He writes that I deserted from the British Army on the 15th of September. The place where I left them was about 17 miles from New York on a foraging party, where I left a foraging party and not being ordered to stay in camp, 7 miles from New York, as was a common. As to fatigue, I had not so large a share of it as private soldiers, though I had a considerable one. Deserter accounts are pretty common in the Revolutionary War. But what's remarkable about this letter is Ewing relates that his service in the 42nd was not as a common soldier, but as a member of the band of music. And this is one of the very few moments in history that we have words from a bandsman describing his service. Let's see what he writes. Unfortunately for us, he writes that it is so tedious to be as presently elated, and that's all Ewing gives us about what being in the band of the 42nd was. Tonight, I hope to build and try to explain what Ewing thought was too tedious to elate, describe what Ewing's service was in the 42nd during those times before he deserts. But before we dive deeper, we're first going to need to establish what is and isn't a band of music, and their origins dating back to Western European armies, specifically the British. When talking about military musicians and bands, the most common images that come to mind are perhaps the modern bands that serve in armies today, the pomp or the 19th or 20th century parade. And here in America, we think of the drummers and fifers that served during the Civil War. At times, collectively referred to as field music, these groups served various purposes, just like their 18th century counterparts. For the 18th century, there were two main musical entities that existed in the British Army: drums and fifes, and bands of music. Of course, there were trumpeters and buglers who served in the cavalry regiments and light infantry companies, but for our purposes tonight, we're going to just focus between drums and fifes and bands. They, often balancing between their official and unofficial status, 18th century bands of music found themselves between two realms, entertainment and military duties. Drums and fifes, on the other hand, almost lived entirely their existence in the military duties realm, while also still providing entertainment through that. One of the easiest ways to make distinctions between drums and fifes and bands of music is to examine how contemporaries referred to the two groups. Within the British, they're pretty straightforward. They refer to fifers as fifers, drummers as drummers, which could also be for the actual drummers, like people playing the drums, or sometimes they might refer to the groups of drums and fifes as just drummers. And then the other one is the drums, which could be the physical instrument, just the drums. It could be the drummers, or again, annoyingly, collectively, the drums and the fifes of the regiment. It's important to note that the British were shrinking down how many fifers are being allowed in regiments. They're trying to dwindle them. Some regiments follow this. They were ordered only a fifer for the Grenadier Company. Other regiments ignored this ruling entirely and still kept recruiting fifers. Americans are a bit more eclectic. They refer to them as fifers, in New England as whifes and whifers, drummers, drums, music, with either just a C or music with a CK, musicians, and then one unique one, General Artemus Ward, who was the commander of the Eastern Department, referred to them as musicianers. So only for him can you call them that. You'll notice, though, that a term missing on this page is field music. As of now, it seems that this term is at least 19th century in origins, as there's been no contemporary reference discovered where anybody in the 18th century called them field music. And we're going to do the same tonight. For our purposes, we'll distinguish between the bands and the drums as drummers and fifers, or bands of music and bandsmen. For members of bands of music, though, you'll see it's a much shorter list. Both sides generally refer to them as musicians, the band, or the band of music. For Americans, the confusion referring to both drums and fifes and band members as musicians might have existed, but it's important to note that most American officers and writers generally save the term for members of the band, and for the most part, copy the practices of their British counterparts. It's also worth noting that compared to the British Army, the Continental Army had far fewer bands of music, as they were an extra expense already on a cash-strapped army. For the sake of regularity in this presentation, like I mentioned, when referring to members of the bands of music, we're going to refer to them as musicians or bandsmen, and that's what James Ewing was. To solidify the differences for us before we go any further, fifes and drums, they're carried officially on the muster rolls. If you're a fifer and drummer, you are enlisted. That is your rank, fifer or drummer. And you're receiving public pay. You're receiving pay as a member in the military. They have certain duties in camp. They play when to wake up, when to go to sleep, when to close down the taverns and the sutlers. They perform a military ceremony, such as funerals and military parades. They also might take part in battle. Some drummers would actually carry out commands, but for the most part, that's only one drummer per regiment dishing out commands. The rest of the drummers and fifers are usually acting as stretcher bearers, taking away wounded officers first and then soldiers. Bands of music are a little bit more confusing. Sometimes they're carried officially on muster rolls as enlisted soldiers. A band of music was a private expense bought by the officers of the company. They would pool money together and pay these bandsmen. Some British officers were cheaper than others, and so they did something sneaky. They would enlist soldiers as a private in the regiment, so they received regular public pay, and then they would supplement the pay of being trained musicians, paying them out of the officers. Historian Don Haggis has multiple accounts of this, and we'll see later on, we have evidence that the officers of the 42nd were doing just this for James Ewing. They don't have official military duties in camp, meaning they're not regulating the day in camp, they're not charged to do pieces. However, they do perform military ceremonies such as parades, reviews for officers, but they are beholden, as they are being paid for by the officers, they are beholden to their requests, performing in not military, just regular balls, dances, so on and so forth. Bands of music also do not take part in battle at all. There is no account of a band of music playing during battle, playing into battle. I thought I had one account once in my life, but I chased it on a microfilm hunt, and it turns out it was a bad citation. So until then, until I find that, no account of band of music in battle. Now that said, there are definitely instances in both the American and British armies that blur the lines between the drums and fifes and bands. This is a letter from General Sullivan in the Continental Army writing to George Washington. Sullivan was trying to describe why the band of music of Colonel Jackson's additional regiment was not suited to play for entertainment for Washington's officers that winter in Morristown. They're very bored. Washington requests the band to kind of help them out. General Sullivan's reply is this: I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your excellency's esteemed. I beg leave to inform your excellency that Colonel Jackson's band is by no means complete. He has 4 musicians and but 2 instruments of music, which were procured by his officers without any expense to the public. His principal musician does the duty of fife major and has the charge of some lads whose progress in music will not qualify them to do the duties of the camp. His loss, therefore, will be severely felt and much regretted. For this reason, I would beg leave to recommend to your excellency the band of Colonel Webb's, now at Warren, which is in Rhode Island. It is complete and composed of promising youths, and it is independent of the music necessary for the duty of the regiment. Its removal will not be so injurious to the corps to which it is annexed. So as you can see from this letter, Colonel Jackson's band seems to be supported by the officers. The 4 musicians were not collecting public pay, and it appears to be that, as is new, as only 2 musicians out of the 4 have instruments that are being bought directly by the officers. Sullivan also refers, like in his letter, to Colonel Webb's additional regiment's band, which on the other hand, as he says, has their members on the muster rolls receiving public pay. Therefore, that's why George Washington seems he can be fit. Now, this letter exchange goes back and forth multiple times. so long that the winter encampment of Morristown ends and Webb's band never leaves. Instead, Colonel Webb's band goes on the Sullivan expedition, which is where you want a band going out to the woods of New York. Sullivan notes, though, here that the bandmaster or the principal musician is also the fife major. And this appears to be a relatively common practice in the Continental Army for regiments, and it's also being done in the British. This is a deserter ad from the 29th Regiment of Foot from 1770 while they were stationed in New York. The 29th, as you may or may not know, is famed as the regiment whose soldiers fired upon the mob at the Boston Massacre. The 29th was also unique, as all the drummers in the regiment were at one point enslaved and gifted to the colonel. This deserter is for a fifer named William Simpson. He's wearing the uniform of a regimental drummer, but the ad notes that Simpson played well on the flute and plays a little on the violin and French horn. The ad never explicitly states that Simpson was a member of the band, but his choice of instruments implies that he could be part of it, and we know the 29th has a band. He must have been at least also a valuable member, as at the end, Colonel Carr was ready to pardon him for deserting if he returns. While on this topic of instrumentation, a band's instrument is also what sets it apart from the fifes and drums. The music a band played was generally written for the German practice of harmony music. Unlike the soft string music you think of in the 18th century, designed to be played indoors in settings, harmony music is the opposite. It was designed to be loud, things played at garden parties, parades, and other outdoor functions. Generally, in harmony music, the tradition is scored for at least 6 instruments: clarinets, hautbois. This is an example, a reproduction of an 18th century hautbois. The English pronounce them as hautboys, but today we know them as an oboe. This is the Baroque oboe. It would also include horns and bassoons. Something. Cool. The band of the 23rd Regiment of Foot, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, in 1786, under bandmaster Jacob Lacroix, follows this instrumentation. You see 2 clarinets, 2 hautbois, 2 bassoons, 2 horns, and then 1 timpani player. By the end of the 1780s, we start seeing more elaborate drums coming into effect. We can also see this in the band of the Royal Artillery in 1762. This is unique as we get the Articles of Agreement for the regiment. The band follows a similar structure when it was first formed. In Article 1, it reads, "The band consists of 8 men, who must also be capable to play upon the violoncello, bass, violin, and flute, as other common instruments." Now, it appears as if the band of the Royal Artillery were seeking not just to band for military occasions, but also for indoor functions as well, with the inclusion of string instruments. Interesting to note is the band of the Royal Artillery famously made up the bulk of the orchestra for the premiere of Handel's Music for the Royal Fireworks. And during that performance, the fireworks set the stage on fire. Handel refused to stop the show, and they kept on playing. We can see this playing out, though, in the strings, which are featured in that, which would make sense why, being stationed in London, they would make up part of this orchestra. The rest of the articles are: the regiment's music consists of 2 trumpets, 2 French horns, 2 bassoons, and 4 hautbois or clarinets. These instruments to be provided by the regiment, but kept in repair by the head musician. The musicians will be looked upon as actual soldiers and cannot leave the regiment without a formal discharge. The same must also behave them according to the Articles of War. The aforesaid musicians will be clothed by the regiment. And then the last part is in the handwriting of Colonel Phillips himself, meaning he felt it was important enough to add that providing the musicians are not found to be good performers at their arrival, they will be discharged, and at their own expense. This is meant to make the person who engages the musicians careful in his choice. Now, these articles, while for the Royal Artillery, are generally being followed in this practice by other officers. So we can see that these men are professional musicians. They're being charged with certain responsibilities. They can't just leave the regiment. They are part of it. They're being clothed and taken care of by them as well. Bands of music, though, don't have their origin in England or even in Paris. They trace their origins back to the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottoman Empire starts to regain footholds in Europe in the 1600s, Turkish or Janissary music starts to spread to Western European courts, especially when the Ottoman Empire sends delegations into Paris, into Versailles. The Turkish Mété, or band, represented for these Turkish leaders power as well as status. There's a European obsession with what they deem as exotic, and to them, these loud instruments with percussion, cymbals, is just the thing that they can spend money on to show off. They combined the Turkish practice with percussion in Mayday with harmony music. We then get instruments such as kettle drums, cymbals, bass drums, and then bells on a stick called jingling johnnies. We can see some of these practices in images of bands of music. This is an image of the changing of the guard in front of St. James's Palace in 1792. We can see in it, both in the front, a band of music leading the column, and then fifes and drums. So let's get a detailed image. You'll see that in between, there are three African musicians dressed in Janissary clothing, such as turbans, more lace. One's playing cymbal, the other one's playing a bass drum, and the other one's playing a tambourine. In this detail, though, we can see the cymbal player, those instruments, all dressed, like I said, in those Turkish or Janissary style uniforms. It was common practice to employ Africans, as in this white-centric society, they're viewed as the embodiment of exoticism. The image on the right shows John Fraser, who was a percussionist in the band of the Coldstream Guards, and he wears a similar uniform to that of the percussionist in the band in the Changing of the Guards image. Around his neck, you'll notice a silver collar, which is a piece of fashion only seen on bandsmen who are of African origin. Both the collar and the silver cuffs on him were engraved with devices or symbols of the regiment. In addition, the tambourine you'll notice he's playing in the colorized image contains devices also belonging to the Coldstream Guards. Now, we've talked a bit about instrumentation and such, and terms unique to the bands. We've even dived deeper into the uniforms of bandsmen dressed as janissaries. Drummers and fifers in the armies typically wore coats in the styles of reverse facings, or the opposite of the regiment. So looking at a coat, the body, the red portion, that's that. And then the blue in this image, that's called the facing. That tells you potentially what regiment they're with, depending on the lace and the buttons as well. When I say reverse facings, if I was in the British Army, let's say I was in the 17th Regiment of Foot, then I wear a red coat with white facings. Drummers would do reverse. We would have a white coat potentially with red. That was to distinguish who they were. In this deserter ad, though, we'll see that it's common for officers to decide for themselves what the uniform of the band would be. And they did this to also distinguish, one, how much they were going to spend, but make them unique from the actual drummers and fifers. In this deserter ad from the 17th, it writes that this deserted is John Humphreys. He plays well in the French horn and fife. And when he deserted, he was wearing a musician's uniform of the regiment, which was a scarlet coat with a white cape and cuffs laced with silver with white buttons, having the numbers of the regiment, white cloth breeches, and a silver laced hat. So not the white face red of the drummers and fifers, but a red coat with white facings, but still unique from the enlisted men. It's scarlet, not that deep madder red. They added silver lace and ornamentation. It was for the officers to show how much money they're going to spend. And the silver lace and those extra expenses, such as the scarlet cloth, was one way of doing so. James Ewing, though, was in the 42nd Regiment of Foot. And like I said, after the Battle of Carillon, they became a royal regiment. Originally, they wore red coats with buff facings. But from that point on, being royal, they're going to wear red coats with blue facings. Royal regiments were always unique. Their drummers do not do reverse facings. In this image, you can see the drummers of the Guards regiments, and they're not in a blue coat with red facings because they're royal, they're in a red coat with blue facings. Some regiments doing that chose to reverse for their bands. The band of the 21st Regiment of Foot, or the Royal North British Fusiliers. This deserter ad of John Grant, he's wearing a blue jacket turned up with a red cape. So blue jacket, red facings. We can see in a royal regiment like the 42nd. Now, I know some people listening might be killing for me to say we know exactly what James Ewing was wearing and what his uniform was. And for some also, being it's the 42nd Highlanders, would love for me to say that they're wearing kilts and Scotch bonnets like in the Pipers. Unfortunately, all we know about the 42nd's band and what their clothing was comes from this inspection return on August 3rd, 1774. The inspector reports that there was 2 pipers and a very good band of music. Barring a trip to the UK to go look at the military archives, which unfortunately I didn't have the time to do this time around, we don't know at this moment what James Ewing was wearing. But I think it's pretty safe to say that he might have been in a blue coat, red facings, probably breeches, not a kilt. Most Highland regiments reserve the kilt and the Scottish clothing for the actual bagpipers. It's a little hard to see on the screen, but the guy in the yellow coat, he is in the 25th Regiment, a regular enlisted British regiment, but of heavy Scots origin. And they had a piper with them. They gave him a yellow coat like a drummer, but he's unique. The drummer, which I cut out of the image, is not wearing a kilt, but the bagpiper does. So now we know about bands and music. We know about instrumentation. We know about terms. We know a little bit about the uniforms. Well, let's dive into what James Ewing, his service looked like, and why it was so tedious to elate. Bands were about, like I said, impressing the listeners, whether it be through music or through uniforms. At times, those being impressed could be heads of state, it could be dignitaries, and it could be military officials. Others could be the civilians of the places the army was in or just recently captured. While the British Army captured New York City in 1776, it entered as a triumphant victors. In this scene, we can see leading the column into New York City a band of music. The dudes in the yellow coats right up front. You can see them playing instruments such as the bassoon on the right and the left, horns, like natural trumpet horns, and then French horns in the front. Yeah, we got that. Cool. This scene repeated itself, though, in 1777, when the British Army captures Philadelphia just south of us. The Pennsylvania Ledger notes that when the Army captured the city, they marched in with Colonel Harricourt of the 16th Light Dragoons leading the column, followed by the Earl Cornwallis. And we get a little snippet of what a band might play from this. Upon taking the city, the last line of it is with a band of music playing God Save the King. Bands of music, while being bought by the officers and supplied for them, didn't just play in official military ceremonies. Officers paid for these bands out of their extra salaries. In order to try and defer the costs, as well as provide a public service and like a public relations service for the British Army, some officers in military bands would play for public concerts or assist in ceremonies. In their downtime while in Boston, the band of the 29th Regiment of Foot performs there while garrisoning it before hostilities broke out. The ad for this concert notes that Fife Major John McLean was going to put on multiple concerts while here in America with their band. In addition to the band performing, McLean, also being the Fife Major, decides to drag in, at the end of the ad, it notes that there will be several pieces of music performed by the fifers and drummers of the said regiment. John McLean ended up taking this performance on the road, or at the least the British Army made him take this performance on the road. By 1771, McLean finds himself leading another concert, this time in Philadelphia. We get a little bit more of a clue, though, what kind of repertoire a band of music played from this ad. It writes that John, by permission and particular desire for the benefit of Mr. John McLean, so the money's going to him himself, the concert will consist of 2 acts, commencing and ending with favorite overtures performed by a full band of music with trumpets, kettle drums, and every instrument that can be introduced with propriety. The performance will be interspersed by approved authors. A solo will be played on the German flute by John McLean, and the whole will conclude with an overture composed for the occasion by Philip Roth, master of the band belonging to His Majesty's Royal Regiment of North British Fusiliers. So we get a more of an idea. We see overtures, we see martial music as well as popular music, but we can also see bands of music cooperating with each other. In this case, the band of the 29th Regiment is going to be supplemented by the band of the 21st Regiment, and their bandmaster, Philip Roth, has enough musical capabilities to compose and score out a piece for multiple instruments. In this ad, we get a whole almost set list. This is from the 64th Regiment of Foot. They're also going to perform a grand concert while in Boston on April 11th, 1774. It includes solos on the German flute. This is a German flute. We would call this today a Baroque flute. You'll notice this is made of wood. It only has one singular key on it, so it'll only play a D sharp. That's the only difference between like a modern flute per se. But in this ad, we get a full set list, like I mentioned. We get a name of a play. It's going to play the Symphony from Artaxerxes, which is a very popular opera at the time, written by Thomas Arne. It's about military conquest and glory in the time of Persia in 465 BC under King Xerxes. So still a popular opera piece, but has that kind of military relation you expect from a military band. It also notes a hunting song. While not naming it, it's very possible it could have been the aria from the opera with early horn from the popular 1736 opera, The Royal Chase. In the spirit of John McClane, and as an amateur flautist myself, I thought it'd be appropriate to play a few select songs played by bands of music and potentially played by, or at the very least, known by James Ewing in the world he lived in. This is the hunting song, or the opera from the World Chase, being with early horn. I'm going to play it on German flute as one. I can't play the oboe as much as I've tried, and I don't have a full band behind me, so I thought it'd be appropriate for flute. So this is the aria from World Chase with early horn. Well, I don't have the horns in the band, but you might have noticed that some of the jumps in it that mimics the hunting calls of the horn. So this piece, hunting, a popular pastime of the officers, of course, would have related to them. Now, as I mentioned, as bandsmen were paid partially or entirely from the officers' personal expenses, they were beholden to the officers first. Many regiments use their bands for performance at dinners and dances. Some use them for other purposes. Alexander McRaby was a young man in Philadelphia, and he writes to his sister in the midst of a very long and boring winter. And in his letter, he complains about the lack of opportunities he's had to meet eligible young women around town, except for at church meetings. Fortunately for Mr. McRaby, the band of the Royal Irish Regiment was garrisoned in Philadelphia, and its officers liked to use their musicians to impress the local women. In the letter, he writes, "We, with 4 or 5 young officers of the regiment in the barracks, drink as hard as we can to keep out the cold, and about midnight sally forth, attended by the band, which consists of 10 musicians, horns, clarinet, hautboys, and bassoons, march to the streets and play under the window of any lady you choose to distinguish, which they seem to esteem a high compliment. I have been out twice and only gotten a violence cold by it once." So the band of the Royal Irish wasn't just the inspiration for the scene with the boombox from the movie Say Anything. They also performed at college commencement ceremonies in Philadelphia to add to those ceremonies. Bands like Ewing's 42nd would have played songs the officers knew and loved, such as that first one. Another one that we know officers in America loved was the tune Britons Strike Home, written by Henry Purcell in 1695. And allegedly, Sir Henry Clinton requested to be played by the orchestra, or perhaps the band of music, at a ball given in New York. This next piece I'm going to play is Britain Strike Home. Thank you. Now, a performance I discovered that we know for certain James Ewing played at was on the November 30th, 1781. Prince William, the third son of King George III, was in New York City. Prince William was just 16 years of age, and he was serving as a midshipman or a very low-ranking officer in the Royal Navy in Admiral Digby's fleet aboard the ship Prince George. Later in life, Prince William would become King William IV, as his brothers died without legitimate heirs. Prince William was fond of a pretty good time. In 1780, he and his shipmates were arrested for a brawl in Gibraltar. Williams was promptly released, though, when his identity as the prince was discovered. Captain John Peebles, one of the audience members for James Ewing, a captain in the Grenadier Company, writes in the diary that after a dinner in which Prince William attended, the band of music and the pipes of the 42nd played alternately. We know for a fact James Ewing played for royalty. He played for the future King of England. However, the Prince William seemed much more interested in the bagpipe than he did in Ewing's band, as he remarks, Peebles, that being highly pleased with the piper gave him a bumper after every tune, and the band did not receive a bumper after each tune. During Williams's visit, though, there are many military parades and ceremonies in his honor. In those, it's likely Ewing would have played marches that were unique to the 42nd Regiment. In a Fife manuscript published by James Aird in 1782 in Glasgow, Aird attributes two marches to the 42nd Regiment, calling them just Quick Step of the 42nd, and then the other one is a really original Second Quick Step of the 42nd Regiment of Foot. Naming was not Aird's forte, as you can see. I'll close my musical portion of this with two songs that were very highly likely played by James Ewing's band, or at the least, he heard these played by the fifers and drummers of that regiment. I'll play them right back to back. The first one is the first quick step, and the other one is the second quick step. while in New York, besides playing for royalty, Ewing met a young woman named Amelia, and he marries her on June 30th, 1782. In the letter, he writes to his sister-in-law asking about his life. What country my wife of? She was born on Long Island near New York, where I married her June 30th, 1782. He writes this whole letter, and at the very last line goes, oh, by the way, my wife, whose name is Amelia, joins me in love to you both. British soldiers who married local women, like many of them, Ewing began to plot his departure from the army. In the letter back home to his family, Ewing writes that he deserted the army on the 15th of September, 1782. On September 17th, he reached the Continental Army, where he was interrogated for information. In this report, in the George Washington papers, it says that September 17th, spelling his name incorrectly, James Ewing of the 42nd Regiment deserted from the 15th from a foraging party near Phillips. Ewing went on to give the location of the regiments, including his own. They mentioned that at Horn's Hook was the 37th and 42nd, and that at Harlem Heights was 38th, the 40th, and 54th. What's remarkable about the letter and this piece is that, one, Ewing writes the letter in 1790. He remembers all the details, and both documents corroborate each other. And he mentions that in this interrogation and in the letter that he was out on foraging duty. Foraging duty was the act of soldiers in small groups who joined the guard of a sergeant or a low-ranking officer to go out, gather wood, food, supplies, what have you. This is one of the very few, if not the only documented instance I've gotten from a bandsman that mentions he was doing soldier's duties, that as a forager, likely leading us to the conclusion that the officers of the 42nd, despite being a royal regiment, were rather cheap in breaking the rules of the British Army. They were enlisting Ewing as a private soldier, so he would not appear as a bandsman on their rolls, but as a private, and that's why he's out there still doing foraging duties in between when he's not playing music. Now, in his letter back home, though, he laments that he wishes he had deserted sooner. But in this excerpt, he mentioned that his station in the army prohibits it or makes it difficult. That's likely because he's under such close watch and under such proximity to the officers of the 42nd. His absence would be noted immediately when the band goes to perform and we're missing one other instrument. But by 1782, the war is starting to wind down. It's going to end in 1783, spoiler alert, after the defeat of Cornwallis at Yorktown in 1781, the previous year. Ewing's now married, and he's married to a local woman. His situation has changed completely. But what didn't change, is he notes, is his feelings. He writes that, I never from the first approved of the conduct of the king and ministry respecting America, and that throughout his 3 years in service in the army, he was a fixed Whig in sentiment. From New York, it seems, Ewing fled towards New Jersey, but his perils were not at an end. He writes how he had to dodge loyalists or refugee Tories who were patrolling the area, most likely around in North Jersey, looking for deserters to return to New York. He then adds in the letter that from there, he has arrived in Hopewell, Hunterdon County, in the state of New Jersey. It seems, though, in this initial letter, his sister-in-law, like any family member, was writing back home for one specific purpose. She was asking, can I have your pension that you are rightly owed as a British soldier? To that, Ewing only has one response. Your questions respecting the pension, I think, is now answered. As he is deserter, there is no pension for him, and his sister is out of money. Now, that ends Ewing's military service. Let's see, and thanks to the huge debt of Lewis Layman and his research, what the rest of Ewing's life looked like. Ewing's arrival in Hopewell was disliked by some. British deserters, like I said, had been through the area, and they remarked that in Hopewell, they had stolen goods, made a mess of themselves, been bad employees, and that the people of Hopewell were not too happy to have a deserter in their town. However, Ewing adds that it was through an indulgent providence I soon found friends who have shown themselves such in the time of my adversity. Ewing was eager to show to the town he was not like the previous British deserters, and he sought what was honest work. He began to have a work as a weaver, making cloth. However, he notes that he wasn't very good at it, and that his health failed him, and that he was no longer able to continue, and he felt much discouraged. As a bandsman, Yeah, I did it right. As a bandsman, though, Ewing would have been highly educated, at the very least in music. He could read notation. We know bandsmen could compose pieces. He would have been literate, as noted by this letter itself. And he also would have mingled with British aristocrats, and he knew the importance of a formal education and what it could bring. He soon found work as a schoolmaster in Hopewell, and then eventually he also worked as a schoolmaster and gave an education in Westville, about 5 miles from here. He also notes in his letter that he knows how to survey lands and draw maps, which was an important skill needed by property owners in a young America. And perhaps he even gained this knowledge of surveying maps and drawing them from other surveyors in the British Army. Throughout his letter home, he thanks a divine creator and providence for his guidance and protection. Ewing, as we can see, is a man of deep faith. And he wrote that in 1789, he was asked by the congregation to preach, and that in June of the year, he was licensed, but he was still teaching school part-time to support his family. He and Amelia had 8 children together that needed to be clothed, housed, and fed, and 8 children were expensive. The town records of Hopewell make note that in April 1794, he was voted by the board to have the use of Matthew Poole's English annotations on the Holy Bible, which was a popular reference in the 18th century. Just a month later, James Ewing officially became Reverend James Ewing, being ordained to the ministry in the First Baptist Church of Hopewell. Ewing noted in his letter home that he never liked the policies of George III and his ministry in America, and that he was always an ardent Whig. On the death of George Washington in 1799, Ewing composed a song to conclude a sermon commemorating his passing. In this song, he praised the Almighty for raising great Washington, guiding and aiding his plans of a free and independent nation, and that would respect the individual liberties and where all could find success. He concludes the song asking for God to bring more men like him to prevent those that would seek to ruin the young nation. It's important to note that James Ewing, a man who served in the British Army against Washington himself, was now thanking Washington at his death for the opportunity for Ewing to reinvent himself, find happiness for him and his family, and to live peaceably under his own vine and fig tree. Unfortunately, 6 months after this ceremony, his wife Amelia passed away. Reverend Ewing would remarry in 1801 to Elizabeth Lay, a member of the congregation. But in 1806, shortly after delivering a funeral sermon for a young man of Hopewell, Ewing fell ill. This is his obituary from the United States Gazette, published in Philadelphia in June 3rd, 1806. It notes that he fought for 3 weeks with the belief that he would be relieved by the great Redeemer, but that he succumbed, at just 52 years of age, leaving behind his 8 children, a widow, and a mournful congregation and community. The band of music in which James Ewing served was in the deepest sense an institution of the 18th century officer class, imposing its cultural aspirations on the military machine. It was not paid for by the crown because it did not serve the crown's military purposes. It was paid for by the officers because it served their social ones. It was a little piece of European courtly culture planted into the field armies of a global war. But it required real men with real skills, who could play oboe or clarinet or bassoon, who could read notation or learn by ear, who could perform under the gaze of officers or royalty, who knew exactly what good music sounded like. Those men were drawn from the same recruiting classes and pools like the rest of the army, from Ireland, Scotland to England, occasionally from the continent, and they brought their own histories, loyalties, and calculations to their service. For Ewing, the band of music was an education as much as an assignment. Whatever his background before enlistment, his service in the 42nd Band gave him skills to perform in social settings as well as adapt to them. The musical literacy, the capacity to perform in formal social settings, the proximity to officer culture and expectations, all of this was preparation, however inadvertent, for a life of community leadership. The 42nd Regiment itself occupies an important place in the story. Its Highland identity, its traditions, existed alongside the band of music, which represented a different and explicitly continental model of musical culture. Ewing was part of that second, less famous tradition, the wind players in civilian-influenced harmony, not the pipers or the drums and fifes in the battle line. That he served in one of the most storied regiments of the British Army is a biographical fact that adds more texture without entirely determining meaning. The 42nd's reputation was built on Ticonderoga dead and the Long Island fighting. Ewing's contribution was altogether different. His desertion in 1782 was in the end a rational act. The war was all but lost. The regiment was going to return to Great Britain. He had a wife here in America. Whatever future waited back in Scotland for an enlisted bandsman was unlikely to compare what an ambitious, skilled, literate young man might make of himself in America. The risks were real, such as discovery or punishment, but the opportunity was realer itself. The New Jersey pastorate is the final piece of the story, and perhaps the most remarkable. It suggests not merely a change of circumstance, but a genuine transformation of self, or perhaps at least the expression, at last, of a self that military service had been suppressing. I'll conclude with Ewing's final lines to his sister and brother-in-law. After describing his whole life story, he asks for forgiveness for desertion. He remarks, and the irony is not lost upon me, that as a Presbyterian, he is converted to being a Baptist, and he asks for their forgiveness. The irony being I'm in a Presbyterian church right now, giving this talk. But he closes out and he chose his lines from the Gospel of John and said, that is, if you know anything what is to be born again, what he quotes from John 30, without this let your outward profession be what it may, you are not one of his real disciples, and can have no part of lot in that glory which shall be revealed. Ewing had that rebirth that he quotes multiple times in his life. He rebirthed into a new career in the British Army. He deserted, he rebirthed again a new life and made a new family here in Hopewell. He would become a Baptist minister, rebirthed himself spiritually. It's through music, war, and spirituality that Ewing reinvented himself. Thank you very much. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not thank the following people for their support and encouragement. Lewis Lehman for his remarkable research finding this letter. Dr. Raul Camus, Asher Lurie for having me, Don Hagest, Sherry Rapp, John Reese, Andrew Kurt, Gary Vorwald, and Don Troiani for helping me out with research, giving me some leads. Gregory Thieberg, as well as the Old School Baptist Meeting House, the Hopewell Museum, the Hopewell Presbyterian Church, and the Hopewell Valley Historical Society for their sponsorship. So thank you very, very much. I think I've got time for questions if it's not too late. I want to get everybody home. Yeah.
You don't know what instrument he played then?
No, unfortunately, the letter he doesn't remark, and most in the bandsmen's or like the accounts, they never actually describe. I would love to be able to say. The most common instruments in bands we usually see are oboists or oboes. That's a pretty good guess, but not for certain. A lot of them, though, like we saw, were multi-instrument players. Most men at that time could when they're playing instruments, so he possibly played multiple ones depending on the need.
Sounds like he was a singer too, sang from pulpit.
Yeah, he probably could. Yeah, at the very least, saying he's composing music. So yeah, bands they would sometimes do operatic pieces like during those concerts we saw. But like during regular performances, parades, not much singing. But yeah, he definitely had vocal musical talents too. He didn't, as far as we know, he doesn't like notate or any composing while in the military per se. Not every bandsman does. Philip Roth is one of the unique ones. We know other bands do, but no, there's no competition at the time. Yeah. He is. Yeah, he is. You can go visit. Yeah. Yeah. Him and Amelia's. No, I don't believe so. Who? Oh, okay. Got it. Is that the Joe next door?
Yeah.
Oh, I know this Joe now. I've learned all about this Joe while being here. Cool. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'll be around too if you want to like ask me questions or two. I'm more than happy to. Thank you so much.